All right, Josh. Florida State is an interesting one to talk about. There's a lot of heat around this Florida State team, and they had a nice round 10-win season, 10-3. Although Athlon magazine has given them credit for a win against NC State that they didn't have, which makes them would have made them 11-2. I think there's a lot to like here. I think that they're finally getting comfortable with good coaching in Norvell and shaking off the years of just not having quality coaching. They've got some talent there. People don't realize how good Jordan Travis was last year and really how good this offense was last year. Josh, Jordan Travis was tied for fifth overall at 9.1 yards per attempt last year, but there were only two Power 5 quarterbacks who threw for more yards per attempt than Jordan Travis. That's C.J. Stroud and Hendon Hooker in 2022. And those were 9.5, so not even that much further off from him. 24 touchdowns on 5 interceptions, super high rating. There's two things that concern me this year, Josh. You can talk about either one or both. One is for all of the fair hype that Travis and Florida State's getting, I don't think people realize how much this defense let them down last year. And I don't think people realize that this is a sneaky hard schedule this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with Florida State has been inconsistency. So I'm going to answer one of those questions and then add an answer you didn't ask for, and then I'll flip the schedule back to you. But in terms of defensive performance and in terms of just consistency of performance in general, the problem with Travis is that he was a 9.1 yard per attempt guy, but it was very up and down. He had 3 games below 7 yards per attempt. North Carolina State, in that loss, he threw for 6 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. He was only 50% passing for 180 yards. Against Clemson, in that loss, 6 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, 254, 24-42. He had to throw a lot, kind of out of necessity. But still not a great average. And then Syracuse, weirdly, it was 38-3 game, and he went 21-23, but he only threw for 6.7 yards per attempt and 155 yards passing. There were just games where they didn't get much. Even like the Louisville game, which was a close win, only threw for 157 yards, and it was a 9.2 yard per attempt average, but not great. The problem, I mean, you can really see it across the board, right? Florida, 8 yards. Florida was 9 yards per attempt, but 13 of 30 passing. That's a 43% passing game. You can't have that kind of inconsistency, right? You can't have games where, some games even if you have a good average, per play, if you're 13 of 30, those incompletions turn into punts, right? If I'm hitting an 80-yard touchdown pass, but I only hit it every 5 plays, I have 16 yards per attempt, and I probably have at least 1 punt for every touchdown because those 4 incompletions are going to lead to 1 or 2 punts, 1 or 2 3 and outs before you get to that touchdown drive. And what ends up happening is, your yard per attempt average is really high, but the number of possessions you have starts getting really rough, right? You get 3 and outs, you're scoring, but you're scoring slowly. You're getting dominated on time of possession. And that's kind of some of the insidious things that go on behind the scenes, I think, with Travis. And to spin it around a little bit, you see a lot of that same problems exist defensively. Now, statistically, they were a top 25 unit. I think they were 24th in yard per play defense. But when you break down the performances, again, the consistency just wasn't good enough. In the final against Oklahoma, gave up 496 yards. The game against Florida, who was not a great offense, gave up 460 and 6.3 yards per play. Louisville, they gave up 495. And then there are other games like Miami and Syracuse where they're giving up 188, 160 yards, 164 to Duquesne. And so their statistics on average look, again, solidly good. Right at top 25 level, 4.85 yards per play. But it's kind of a weird mix of games where they're giving up over 5 yards per play, over 6 yards per play in a lot of instances, and other games where they didn't give up much at all. And so, even like 370 against Clemson is not great. 5.5 yards per play. That wasn't a good offense last year overall. Wake Forest, 405 yards. I mean, I could go down the list. And so that's the deal with Florida State. It's not just about getting better. It's about avoiding those games where either the offense or the defense doesn't play up to their potential. Because if you want to step up from being a 10-3 team, or if you're Athlon 11-2, and you want to move to being a one-loss team, that requires consistency. College football is unlike the NFL, and this is something a lot of people struggle with understanding. The NFL is all about being the best team you can be on average, because every game is pretty similar. Dropping 3 or 4 games is not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. In college football, avoiding losses is the name of the game if you want to be at the playoff level. It's about not having real dud games. It's about not losing to teams you shouldn't lose to. And Florida State's step forward in that regard has to come from a consistency basis, both from Travis and from the defense. And that's important, segue, because the schedule can be a little bit challenging.
All of the fans watching this back home that are pulling for the Duquesne Dukes are going to get at you in the comments for mispronouncing.
Well, the 6 of them can get at me. That's fine.
I think that there's a little bit of a veneer on the season last year that people don't realize that is really present in what you were just saying. And I'm I'm going to spin this positive in a second, but I want to touch on this. I want to live here for just a little bit. That Clemson game, 34-28, but it was 34-14 until like mid fourth quarter, and they tacked on a couple of touchdowns late. They had no business letting Florida play within a touchdown of them. I think the LSU win was good, but there's other games like losing to NC State, scoring 21 on Wake Forest. I'm not mad about giving up 31 to Wake, because Hartman can get hot. They can put up a 45 spot on somebody, but like giving up.
And they ran 85 plays in that game. We talk about that a lot in college, right? The Clemson game was a 67 play game, and the Wake Forest game is an 85 play game. You know, points don't always mean the same things, because some of these teams play at such tempo that, yeah, you're going to give up more points just because they effectively make the game a lot longer.
But you can't let DJU dunk on you for 8.8 and 3 tutties. Like, you just can't. And that's the thing that I think they probably learned. I'll dig a little more into the schedule, but Josh, do you think this is kind of a fair thing to say? You need a year like Florida State had last year before you could ever have an elite year. You don't go from like 6-6 usually, from like 6-6 to national championship contender until you have one of those good years where you just grind through a couple of pretty bad performances and kind of learn who you are. Feels like 2008 Alabama a little bit.
Yeah, and it doesn't always have to come the year prior, but the roster has to know what it looks like, I think. 2018, LSU wasn't particularly good, and offensively they were pretty inconsistent. Auburn was infamously terrible in 2012 before the 2013 run, but it's easy to forget 2016 LSU was quite good. Auburn had just won the national title in 2010, and they were a good football team in 2011. You have to have some knowledge of what it looks like to be a good football team, and to know, I think sometimes you have to know the little things that can cost you a title, right? The roster has to be aware of the inconsistencies that cause you to lose games that you shouldn't lose, and that pushes you to be better. And I don't know how many times you see, like you said, the most common thing for a national champion is a team that lost a couple games the year prior and had games where they weren't consistent enough or weren't well-rounded enough. But the problem, I think, in trying to evaluate all this, and this is not neither positive nor negative, let me be clear, this is also a roster with a ton of transfers, is the new world of it. Defensively, they should be better as a result of transfers, in theory. Offensively, they also take in transfers at key units. The offensive line was a disaster that Jimbo Fisher left them, and if you're an FSU fan, you're probably cursing his name right now, because he did leave a smoking crater. And they've used the transfer portal to shore those things up. But the problem with transfers is there's no continuity with these issues, right? Knowing what happened last year and how you improved and what went wrong, and then just from a developmental standpoint, right, you weren't playing together. And that makes it, I think, a little different and tougher in this era. And I just say this from a perspective of I'm not really sure how to take it, right? Does that sort of negate the need for it because these are guys that struggled at other programs and learned lessons, and they want to fix it here? Or does it mean that the culture that should see an overall shift from one year to another where you step up to another level has a harder time taking that step forward because so many pieces weren't there the year prior. I don't know. I don't know how to evaluate it, but it's definitely an interesting observation. Again, for a team that has a schedule that is capable of winning a title, I think, but also pretty challenging. Kind of a nice, I think, medium ground where you're going to get credit for who you play, but maybe not so utterly brutal that it makes it almost impossible.
It's interesting they play one another, but I like, you talk about transfers. LSU took a lot of transfers too, and I feel like there's schools and coaches whose identity is not conducive to really folding transfers into the culture quickly and getting them to assimilate in a way that makes them super successful. Ole Miss comes to mind. Like, I don't feel like Lane Kiffin, like, he relies a lot on transfers, but I don't think he is a presence that drives culture in a way that gets buy-in super fast, and a team that self-polices and makes people fall in line. Kelly seems like a guy that can do it, but Norvell also seems like a guy that can do it. So it remains to be seen, like you said, but I think it could be a positive. It just depends on, one, whether or not they fold in and really sort of become part of the team in all aspects, and also whether or not they're actually good. The schedule is concerning for me, and we got a lot of SEC listeners. They're going to look at the schedule and kind of scoff at it, but Duke is not a bad football team. Good quarterback, going to be better this year. Clemson is going to be much improved offensively, and this is a team that scored 34 last year on Florida State. Clemson might be, it depends on personnel-wise what they do, but they might be playoff caliber team this year. But Florida State might also be, which means that game is going to be absolutely a monster. Florida loses a first-round quarterback, but probably is going to be a better team overall, including offensively. Neither you nor myself were high on Richardson, and cannot, for the life of either of us, understand why he got drafted where he did. Miami's going to be a better football team, especially offensively. We just got finished talking about that in the Texas A&M preview. That's a tougher game. None of these teams are elite, except for maybe Clemson, but they're all good enough to beat you on any given day. And then, so when you put them all together and you have to play them in a row, or you have to multiple road games in a row, it makes it really tough. But Josh, I wonder, are we going to overreact with the LSU Florida State game on both sides? Whoever wins, whoever loses, is that game so big and just so, like, it was a wonderful event last year. It kind of set the season off. Is that game so big that we run the risk of putting too much weight into the win and the loss in that one?
I mean, almost certainly. The reality is someone's going to come out of the game with a loss, and somebody's going to come out of the game undefeated, right? I mean, that's
riveting.
That's what has to happen.
Really got us on the on the analysis.
Yeah, I know. I mean, this is what they pay me for. Right? There is somebody paying me, isn't there? No. I mean, it's stupid, but this obvious point gets missed a lot, right? That people are going to come out of the first 3 weeks 3-0, and some people are going to come out 0-3. It's the necessity. Somebody wins and loses every game. So who LSU and FSU are is not going to be determined by whether it was a close game. It's not going to be determined by who won the game. I think if FSU wins, they're going to get a lot of credit, but the tendency is going to be to say, oh, LSU wasn't as good. Like, people are always more willing in some ways to hype the high-ranked team that wins than the low-ranked team that upsets the high-ranked team, I think. And it doesn't really matter. I mean, these can both be elite playoff caliber teams and have a close game or what looks to be an ugly game because the defenses are good. And these can be really bad teams, and they could have an all-timer because they have a lot of areas where they struggle, and they causes it to be a wild, fun game. I think, frankly, in the opener last year, that was not good football. And I say that saying that I thought both these teams ended being really good teams. But LSU and FSU were not good football teams week one last year. They just weren't. And it's why that game was so fun and wild, and FSU won at the last moment. It was one of the more fun games of the whole year. But it was kind of fun because it was bad football in a lot of ways. And FSU got a lot better over the course of the year, which I don't think a lot of people appreciate to the extent they should. But it's going to be the same deal. I mean, people are going to overreact to it, and people are going to react differently because of the preseason rankings. Look, those preseason rankings don't matter one iota, really. They really don't. And I know people talk about you are where you are in the polls and you don't move. But yeah, you do move when you win or lose football games. And that's all that's going to matter because these schedules are hard enough that if they are playoff caliber teams, they're going to have to prove it in wins against good football teams themselves. So I think it is going to be an overreaction. Our reaction to the football teams are going to be based on how good they are. No one looks that great in college football early in the season. We forget this every year because we remember bowl season last year. Forget how much teams always kind of start over and have to rebuild every season. And so, yeah, it'll be an overreaction. It's been hyped to be an overreaction, both being top 10 teams. They're going to continue to hype them. But, it's just one game. It's an out-of-conference game. Either one of these teams can lose this game, go undefeated, and probably will make the playoffs. So it doesn't really matter that much. I'm just excited to see a big-time football game. And, and again, even just gauging who these two teams are, I don't feel like I'm going to really know until week 4 or 5. With FSU, until they play Clemson, I'm not going to really draw any strong conclusions. And I'm saying that right now, whether you win or lose. If you lose, I'm not going to hold it against you because LSU may be great. If you win, I'm not going to go too overboard because LSU, still have questions about. You've got to wait and see a little bit, and I think that's fair. And if you want to be critical of it, be critical of it, but realize you're going to prove it one way or another. It's just a matter of waiting out the 3 or 4 weeks to see how good they really are, having played a number of different teams.
For me, there's two things about this game that I love. One, LSU, Florida State playing one another. And like you said, they can play, and it doesn't have a lot of stakes in terms of the end of the year, but they're still playing. They're not, skirting this responsibility of playing out of conference games that matter. Clemson and Florida State are really good about this. Those are two teams, by the way. Florida State doesn't get enough credit. We give credit to Clemson for this and Georgia for this, but Florida State plays Florida at the end of the year. They have an SEC brand name Power 5 on their schedule, and they're also going to open the season with LSU. In an era of Power 5 teams avoiding any out-of-conference Power 5s, like to bake in home games and wins. This is a series they signed up for. They play them 2 years in a row, but both were neutral site games, so nobody got home game credit. I love this. This is awesome. Some of this is probably going to go away with super conferences, but this is completely undersung this year and last year that a Florida State team could have gone and scheduled some G5 that they just bake in a win because they got Florida at the end of the year, and nobody's going to say anything about it. They went out of their way to make it tougher because at some level within their administration, they believe in good competitive football like Georgia does when they don't have to, like Clemson does when they don't have to. So for that, they get a ton of credit from me. Josh, anything else on Florida State before we wrap it up?
Well, the only thing I'll note is we really didn't spend that much time talking about the roster. And it's not that we don't note it or find it interesting. It's just, you only have so much time in a video, but do want to touch on it, right? I mean, this is a team that's bringing in all conference level transfers on top of having all conference level players, right? Cypress at corner is a big addition. I think late in the season, they really figured things out in the passing game. That was a big boon. The wide receiving core, it was clear they didn't really know how to use them early in the year, and later on they figured out where their strengths and weaknesses were. They found a good running back in Benson. Supposedly he's bulked up a lot. There's a lot of stuff to be excited about, but I will say as an outside party, not being able to go to fall camp and see these guys in person, it's hard for me to say a lot more than that until I see them in person. It's so hard to judge transfers because they play at one level of competition against one group of teams. Now they got to play at a different level in a different system around other players. This is a hard team to pick apart on a roster level with all the pieces, front line players in both teams or both sides of the ball playing differently. But there are enough solid pieces that you think it's a good core, and then whether or not those transfers gel is probably going to be the difference between whether they're an elite unit or whether they're kind of a unit like they were last year, where they were pretty good in a lot of ways, but they weren't necessarily consistent, or they weren't complete enough to be consistent in others. I just don't know, and there's no way for me to tell until I see them on a football field.
Honestly, it's probably going to come down to depth and not that starting line talent for Florida State, because now their expectations after having a 10-win season and getting a taste of what can be a really good momentum building year into what's higher expectations, I think is really going to come down to depth. And that's where you need those transfers to not just be bodies. Like, they need to contribute. So, all right, well, that's it for us this week. I hope you like the long format shows, or if you're watching this cut up, we do a long format show every week that's basically, just talking ball. Some of it has previews or team previews, and the season will be game previews, but some of it's just our opinions on some stuff. Thanks for sticking with us this long. Y'all have a great week. God bless.